I now continue Lectures in Christian Doctrine by Dr. Joe Sprinkle. Present lecture will talk about the covenants between God and humans. One of the most important theological concepts in the Bible is the term covenant. Grudem defines covenant as follows: a covenant is an unchangeable, divinely imposed legal agreement between God and man that stipulates conditions of their relationship. There have been a whole series of covenants in the Bible. The way that God has related to people over time has been through covenants. And some theologians see covenants as the central theme of the entire Bible. And so this lecture will elaborate on the theological implications of these covenants. Characteristics of covenants. Covenants refer to an agreement between parties. With covenants between God and people, the parties are not equal, but God is the superior party in the agreements. He can impose stipulations on people, but people cannot negotiate, change, or bargain about the stipulations. So characteristics of a human covenant is a relationship between two parties with mutual obligations between the covenant partners, though clearly in the case of the covenants between God and man, they're not equal parties in the agreement. Now, to the Old Testament believer, religion meant covenant. Old Testament religion was faithful to the covenant, constituted faithfulness to the covenant relationship between God and His chosen people. The religious responsibilities for both the faith and the practice of Israel were covenant responsibilities. Craigie writes this, Peter Craigie, the same basic characteristics of a strictly human covenant are present in a divine covenant. It's a relationship between two parties, God and a human being or nation, and two, mutual obligations between the covenant partners. To the Old Testament believer, religion meant covenant. Old Testament religion was faithfulness to the covenant relationship between God and His chosen people. Religious responsibilities for both the faith and practice of Israel were covenant responsibilities. Now, one of the key slogans of the covenant is, "I will be your God and you will be my people." You get this in Genesis 17:17, Exodus 6 and verse 7, Leviticus 26 and verse 12, Deuteronomy 29 and verse 13, Jeremiah 7 and verse 23, Ezekiel 36 and verse 28, "I will be your God and you will be my people." And it underscores how these covenants establish or regulate relationships between people and God. Now, there are a whole series of major biblical covenants, and we will go through them one by one. These will include the covenant between God and Adam and Eve, an implied covenant, not an explicit one, in Genesis 1 through 3. There was no sign to that covenant, but it had a stipulation: do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The second covenant is a covenant with Noah. You'll see that in Genesis chapter 9. The sign of that covenant is the rainbow, and one of the stipulations is respect for human life made in the image of God. Third covenant is a covenant with Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, which you can read about in Genesis 12 and 15 and Genesis 17. The sign of this covenant was circumcision, and one of the stipulations was to walk before God blameless and to circumcise all your males. And then you have the Mosaic covenant, Exodus 19 through 24 is where that gets established. The sign of the covenant is arguably the ark, or perhaps the tablets of the law. It is not explicit, but one of those would, and the ark contained the tablets of the law, would make sense. The stipulations of the covenant are the 10 Commandments and the laws, such as the Book of the Covenant, which is in Exodus 20, 22 through 23, 33. And then the 5th covenant is the Davidic covenant, 2 Samuel 7, and also mentioned in Psalm 89. There's no sign to that covenant, no stipulations of the covenant, but God promises an eternal dynasty with David. And then finally you get the New Covenant, which is mentioned in at the Lord's Supper in Matthew 26 and cited in Hebrews chapter 8. There's no explicit sign to the covenant, but Christianity has adopted the cross as a sign of that covenant. And the stipulations would be the law of Christ. So these are the major biblical covenants between God and humanity, and we will go through them one by one. First of all, the covenant with Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 2 through 3. There's nowhere in the Bible where this is explicitly called a covenant unless it's said to be so in Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, where it says, like Adam, they have violated the covenant, NIV margin. The problem there is that this translation is disputed. The Hebrew word Adam could also be translated mankind, like mankind they have violated the covenant, in which case it would not be a reference to Adam in the Garden of Eden, but to humanity more generally. But if you do translate it Adam, that would imply that there was a covenant between God and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And even if that verse is not translated there, clearly God had a relationship with these people, and that relationship itself implies something like a covenant, even if it's not explicitly so. Well, the stipulation of the covenant was that they were prohibited from eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You'll read about that in Genesis 2, 16 through 17. There would be blessings with this covenant. The blessing for obedience would be a continued relationship with God and access to the tree of life. But with disobedience to the covenant, there was expulsion from the Garden of Eden and separation from God and death both physically and spiritually. The fall of Adam and Eve into sin represents covenant violation and brought a disruption of the divine-human relationship. Van Grogenen puts it this way on the Adamic covenant: the fall substantially influenced the nature of subsequent religious covenants. The separation of mankind from God clarifies the nature of the human predicament. Created for a relationship with the Creator, sinning humans are excluded from that relationship and cannot on their own accord reestablish it. From that circumstance emerges a distinctive feature of divine human covenants, namely that God alone can initiate the relationship of covenant. Let me move on to the covenant with Noah. The covenant with Noah was consummated after Noah offered an offering to God, Genesis 8, verses 20 through 22. And it is a universal covenant for all mankind. In Genesis 9, 8 through 10, it says, God said to Noah, and to his sons with them, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, and all those that came out of the ark with you, every creature on earth. He goes on to say that I will establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth whenever I bring the clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds. So this is a universal covenant with all of mankind and indeed the whole world. And there's obligations to this covenant. Part of the obligation is respect for life. For your lifeblood, I will surely requiring a reckoning. Those that commit murder by man, their blood will be shed. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man, his blood will be shed. And God puts a stipulation on himself never to send that kind of flood again to destroy the world. Sign of the covenant is the rainbow that's mentioned in the verses that we read. And theologically, Noah's covenant shows something about theology. It shows us that God judges. He wiped out most of mankind. But yet God shows grace. The covenant with Noah and for all mankind shows the graciousness of God despite sin. God shows justice. He has a moral law that regulates the lives of human beings with each other and with God.